It was 2 years ago, back in my second year of college, a time when everything felt like it was still just the beginning of my journey into adulthood. The idea of a cultural project was something every student looked forward to, as it gave us the chance to dive into our creative passions and work together on something significant. The challenge for us was simple: come up with a short film within a month. I was excited and a little nervous. It was the perfect opportunity to test my skills, push my boundaries, and learn from the talented people around me. Little did I know, this project would introduce me to one of the most unpleasant experiences of my college life. During one of our classes, I met him, a guy who was a year younger than me but seemed to fit into the group with ease. He was quiet and not the most talkative at first, but he had this air of curiosity that made him approachable. I was still figuring things out myself, gathering my thoughts and talents, so I ended up chatting with anyone who seemed friendly. He introduced himself and mentioned that he was into horror, something that immediately caught my attention. I had always been a fan of the genre, whether it was movies, stories, or just the overall eerie vibe that horror brought. He told me he was working on an analog horror project, and he mentioned he had a younger friend involved too. They were looking for someone else to join their group, and before I knew it, I was part of their project. He seemed eager, and despite his quiet demeanor, there was something about him that made it clear he was passionate about the story he wanted to tell. I was still in the early stages of figuring out what I could bring to the table, so I figured it would be a great learning experience. Plus, being part of a creative project like this could lead to something cool, right? At first, everything seemed normal. We exchanged ideas, discussed different concepts, and explored what we wanted to do. I showed him some of the work I had done before, just small pieces I had crafted in my free time. He was impressed, or at least that's what I thought. But then, he began to unveil the most bizarre and unsettling part of his vision, the story. This was the moment I should have known better. He took me aside one afternoon to explain the scene he had been working on, something he called the most difficult part of the video. It sounded intriguing at first, until he started describing it. The scene was filmed from a point of view where the camera showed a photographer out in the wilderness, snapping pictures of birds. All was calm until, out of nowhere, he zoomed in on a crow. The crow then morphed into a human figure. I was taken aback. That was a strange concept, but it was the horror genre, and I was used to odd, outlandish ideas. It sounded like it could work, but something about it felt off. I asked him about the plot, wanting to understand more about the context of the scene, the build-up, and the meaning behind it. He had been avoiding telling me much up until that point, but finally, he reluctantly gave in. I didn't know what to expect, but what he told me completely threw me off. His plot was a tangled mess of random ideas that made no sense. It was disjointed, confusing, and frankly disturbing. He had created this strange narrative where there was no clear purpose, no solid structure, and no emotional connection to the characters or events. But it wasn't just the lack of a coherent plot that bothered me. The story seemed to reflect the darkest parts of his mind. There were blatant attacks on various religions, racist slurs directed at Black people, and homophobic undertones woven throughout the script. It wasn't just poor writing, it was full of hate. And worse, he didn't seem to think there was anything wrong with it. I remember the moment it all clicked. I sat there, trying to process what I had just heard. I thought about the possibility that maybe it was just a bad idea, that perhaps I was overreacting. But deep down, I knew this wasn't just bad writing. This was a reflection of who he was, someone who harbored so much bitterness and prejudice. It wasn't just an idea, it was a toxic ideology that was being poured into a film that was supposed to be a creative project. I couldn't stay silent. I argued with him, trying to explain why the content was problematic, why it wasn't just controversial, but outright offensive. I tried to point out that there were better ways to tell a story, ways that didn't spread hate. But instead of listening, he grew defensive and angry. The more I spoke, the more agitated he became. It escalated quickly, and I could feel the tension in the air. I remember him standing up, shouting at me, his face flushed with rage. I thought for a second that he might actually attack me, and I couldn't believe this was happening over something as ridiculous as a short film project. In the heat of the moment, I just grabbed my things and walked out. It wasn't worth it anymore. The project had turned from something I was excited about into a toxic environment I wanted no part of. I handed in my part, which was a simple but effective scene of my own design, and I left the group without looking back. I couldn't be associated with that kind of hate.
It didn't end there, though.
A few weeks later, I happened to be walking past the studio where the project was being worked on. Curiosity got the best of me, so I peered in to see what they had done with the short film. To my horror, they had taken my scene, the one I had carefully crafted, and completely erased it. Not only had they deleted my contribution, but they had also decided to remake the project, copying a popular analog horror series called Mandela Catalog almost scene for scene. It was embarrassing. They had stripped the original idea down and replaced it with an almost identical copy of something that had already been done, just to make it more marketable in some way. I felt a mix of disappointment and anger. It wasn't just that my scene was gone. It was the sheer lack of originality, the laziness in just copying someone else's work. But there was more. To make things worse, they had posted the final product online, on YouTube of all places. I couldn't believe it. Here was a film that had started as an interesting concept, only for it to devolve into something offensive and derivative. As I watched it for a brief moment, I couldn't help but feel disgusted by the entire thing. I knew I had to remove myself from it completely. I worked quickly, contacting the right people to have my name removed from the credits. As far as I could see, it wasn't even that difficult to remove traces of my involvement from the project. Good luck finding it, though. I sincerely hoped it would fade into obscurity. The next year, I found myself in a new project with different students. It wasn't an analog horror film, but it did involve some creative elements that I was excited about. I worked closely with a friend who had created a game, and we used the short film as a way to promote it. It wasn't anything groundbreaking, but it was fun, and it was light years better than the previous year's disaster. It was a chance to move on, to distance myself from the negative experience, and to create something more positive. That whole ordeal taught me a lot about people and creativity. It made me realize just how important it is to work with people who share your values, people who aren't just out for themselves or pushing harmful ideologies. That guy I had worked with, he was one of the most spiteful, self-centered, and prejudiced individuals I had ever met. His entire existence seemed to revolve around tearing others down, spreading hate, and creating something that reflected his bitterness. And I was just one person who had the misfortune of being caught in his web. In the end, that project taught me more about people than filmmaking. It showed me that sometimes the biggest challenges in creative work are not the technical ones, but the people you choose to work with. Not every collaboration is a positive experience, and not everyone is worth your time.